I don't suppose you'd like to try." She said it the way people said things that were meant to be heard by everyone except the person they were said to. Renata Cross stood at the edge of the press area in the lobby of the Vantara data center, 9 days into a system failure that had cost her company $4.2 million daily. Surrounded by journalists who had been asking the same questions for a week, and she looked across the room at the man in the maintenance uniform carrying a clipboard and said it with the particular lightness of someone performing confidence she was rapidly losing. The crowd of reporters turned. Joel Carver stopped walking. He'd been on his way to check the building's secondary FAQ routing, which was his actual job. The job he'd been doing for 11 years in buildings like this one, and he had not intended to be part of whatever was happening in the lobby. He did not want to be part of it. He was holding a clipboard with a routing diagram on it, and he was wearing a uniform that had his name on the chest in embroidered letters, and the whole room was looking at him. He thought about Dara. He thought about $34,000. He thought about 11 years and a handwritten notebook in the bottom drawer of his desk at home. He said, "Sure. Stay with this one. Drop a comment where you're watching from tonight. Let's see how far this reaches." The Vantara data center had been failing for 9 days and 3 hours when Joel Carver walked through its lobby on a Tuesday morning in November. He'd been assigned to the building 6 weeks earlier, when the municipal facilities contractor he worked for had picked up a maintenance contract covering the HVAC and climate systems of 3 commercial buildings in the downtown corridor. Vantara was the largest of them, a 17-story tower whose lower 8 floors were given over to server. Infrastructure that cooled itself via a proprietary climate architecture. Joel had spent 20 minutes studying the schematic of before deciding it was more complex than anything he'd worked on in recent years and would require careful attention. He'd noted that in his intake report. He'd noted the system's age, 12 years in operation, which was old for this class of infrastructure, and the fact that the maintenance logs showed several deferred service items that had been repeatedly pushed to the following quarter for what appeared to be budget reasons. He'd flagged 2 specific components for priority inspection. He'd submitted the report to his supervisor and moved to the next building in his rotation. That had been 6 weeks ago. 4 weeks after his intake, the Vantara climate system had entered a cascade failure. Not a dramatic failure, not the kind with smoke and alarms and emergency shutdowns. The quiet, insidious kind. The kind that started with one monitoring parameter drifting outside its expected range, and then, because no one caught it in time or understood what it meant, propagated backward through the system's interdependencies until the core servers began thermal throttling to protect themselves from overheating, and the data center's output capacity dropped to 31% of normal. 31%. For a data center that hosted infrastructure for 11 financial institutions, 4 healthcare networks, and the Eastern Seaboard processing hub of a major payment processor, 31% was a catastrophe expressed in dollar terms that journalists had been competing to calculate most dramatically for 9 days. Renata Cross had been in front of cameras for most of those 9 days. She was good on camera, the kind of person who'd learned, through years of public exposure, how to hold a microphone stance and maintain eye contact with a questioner and deliver sentences that sounded reassuring even when they contained no reassurance. She had a quality of contained authority that cameras liked. She was 50, with the particular fitness of someone who treated their body as an aspect of professional presentation. Her suits were impeccable. Her expressions were managed. She had over 9 days of questions she couldn't fully answer, not once visibly broken. But Joel had watched her enough in the lobby, in the background of televised briefings, moving through the building's public areas on her way to meetings, to notice something she was managing very carefully not to show. She was scared. Not of the system failure itself exactly, something adjacent to that. Something that the system failure had exposed or was threatening to expose. He'd noticed it the way he noticed things that were off in mechanical systems. Not dramatically, just the particular quality of someone moving slightly differently than the situation required. A controlled quality in her answers that went beyond PR training. Something she was protecting. He hadn't thought much about it. It wasn't his business. He'd been doing his work, checking his assigned systems, logging his observations, waiting for someone with the authority and knowledge to diagnose the failure to actually diagnose it. They hadn't. 207 engineers had passed through Vantara's systems floors over 9 days. He knew this because Boyd, his facilities manager, a placid man who gathered information the way some people collected stamps, comprehensively and without apparent purpose, had told him at their Tuesday morning check-in. 207 specialists, the best the data center industry could produce on short notice, and on Renata Cross's considerable budget. The original system integrator. Engineers from 3 competing climate architecture firms. 2 academic consultants from MIT's Data Center Thermal Management Group. None of them had solved it. Because they didn't know what they were looking at. Joel knew what he was looking at. He had known from the day of his intake inspection, from the 20 minutes he'd spent with the schematic, what system this was and where it had come from. He had recognized the architecture the way you recognize the handwriting of someone you'd worked with for years. Because he'd written half of it. He'd been going back and forth with himself for 9 days about what to do with that knowledge. It wasn't a simple question. The knowledge came with complications that he'd spent 11 years not thinking about, and which thinking about now required walking back into a territory he'd chosen to leave permanently. Haynes had been the most skeptical person in the room, and had become, over the course of their exchange, the person most interested in what Joel was saying. There was a quality in technically excellent people who encountered a problem they couldn't solve, and then encountered someone who had. A specific combination of relief and reluctant admiration and professional recalibration. Haynes had moved through all 3 in the 40 minutes they'd been in the conference room. The question he kept returning to was the documentation gap. How had a system in commercial operation for 12 years, deployed in, Joel later learned, 47 facilities across the country, maintained a critical configuration dependency that wasn't in any documentation available to engineers working on it? Joel could explain this because he'd watched it happen. When a system was built through a combination of calculated specification and empirical testing, as the DTMP had been, the parameters arrived at through testing often got treated differently from the ones arrived at through calculation. The calculated specifications went into formal documentation because they had a derivation path, because you could show your work, because they were the kind of thing that needed to go into a patent filing or a licensing agreement. The empirically derived values were trade knowledge. You wrote them down in your working notes, and you knew them from experience, and they lived in the institutional knowledge of the people who'd built the system. When the business transferred, the institutional knowledge didn't always transfer with it. Thomas had known the values, he'd been present for the testing, he'd seen the notebook. But Thomas had then run the business through a series of transactions and restructurings, and the people who now operated the DTMP under the Helix infrastructure license were not Thomas. They were engineers working from the official documentation package that had been assembled for licensing purposes, which was accurate and complete as far as it went, and did not go far enough. 12 years of successful operation had covered the gap most of the time. The system was robust enough that under normal conditions the default values were close enough. But under sustained extreme load, the kind that Vantara had been experiencing in the weeks before the failure, the margin between close enough and right enough collapsed. Why didn't this fail before? Haynes had asked. 47 facilities, 12 years. Sustained high load is the trigger condition, Joel had said. Most of those facilities don't run at the utilization level Vantara has been running at for the past 6 months. You've added capacity commitments faster than the documentation for your infrastructure has been updated. Haynes had looked at Renata when Joel said this. She'd been looking at Joel. That's a separate conversation, she'd said. Not defensively, just accurately. Yes, Joel had said. The access to the hub room had been arranged without further argument after that exchange. Haynes had escorted him personally, which Joel had not expected but which he understood. Haynes wanted to see what happened, wanted to understand how the fix was accomplished, wanted to add the knowledge to his own understanding in a way that delegating the escort wouldn't have allowed. He'd waited in the corridor while Joel worked. When Joel came out, Haynes had been at the terminal he'd wheeled out to monitor the performance graphs remotely, watching the numbers climb. He'd looked at Joel with the particular expression of a senior engineer acknowledging something he couldn't have done himself. He'd said, "You wrote the calibration specification from memory." "From notes," Joel had said. "I kept a working notebook during the original build. 11 values." Yes, Haynes had looked at the graphs for a moment. "I need those values in the formal documentation. For every facility running this architecture." "That's a conversation for your attorneys and mine," Joel had said. "But yes, they need to be in the documentation." Haynes had nodded slowly, the nod of someone making a mental note that this situation was going to require extended follow-through. "I want to be in that conversation," he'd said. "I'll tell my attorney." They'd ridden back up to the executive floor in the elevator in silence, watching the number on Haynes's phone screen. 93%. 984. He'd been going back and forth. And then Renata Cross had looked across the lobby at the man in the maintenance uniform and said it with that particular likeness. "I don't suppose you'd like to try." And the answer, as it turned out, was yes. Joel Carver had been 26 years old when he and a man named Thomas Feld had spent 14 months in a converted warehouse in Raleigh, North Carolina, building the climate architecture that would eventually be licensed to data center operators across the eastern United States. It had not been called Vantara's system at the time. It had been called the Carver-Feld Distributed Thermal Management Protocol in the internal documentation, and later just the DTMP in the licensing agreements and in the trade publications that covered its introduction, and in the patent filings that represented 2 years of careful legal work by an intellectual property attorney Thomas had hired with money neither of them had. The DTMP was not revolutionary in the way that word usually applied. It wasn't a new physics. It was a systems integration solution, a specific way of coordinating multiple climate and thermal management subsystems so that they responded to load changes predictively rather than reactively. Data centers of that generation had a persistent problem. By the time the monitoring systems detected a thermal event and triggered cooling responses, the response curve lagged the event, and under high load conditions, the lag was enough to cause throttling. The DTMP solved this by building a predictive model into the coordination layer. The system didn't wait to see a temperature rise before responding. It anticipated the rise based on power draw patterns and adjusted ahead of it. It worked. Significantly, the first deployment in a facility outside Charlotte had shown a 22% improvement in thermal stability under high load conditions and a meaningful reduction in cooling energy consumption. The second deployment showed similar numbers. By the fourth, they had enough data to approach licensing partners with confidence. Thomas Feld had been the business half of the partnership. Joel had been the engineering half. That was the rough division. Not entirely accurate, because they both understood both sides well enough to cover for each other. But broadly how they described themselves to investors and partners and the attorney who filed the patents. The patents had listed both their names. Joel Carver and Thomas Feld, co-inventors, assignees. That had been true for 3 years. Then Joel's marriage had ended. It had ended the way some marriages ended, not with a dramatic event, but with the accumulated weight of 2 people who had grown into incompatibility without noticing until the incompatibility was too large to manage. His ex-wife, Rebecca, had been a reasonable person throughout the process, and they had reached reasonable agreements about most things. The business had been less reasonable. He and Thomas had been equal partners, which meant that the dissolution of Joel's personal assets, which included his business stake, required either a buyout or a sale. Thomas had not had the capital for a buyout at the terms Joel's divorce attorney had proposed. The alternative that had been placed on the table by Thomas's attorney was a restructuring. Thomas would acquire Joel's stake in exchange for a payment spread over 5 years and a release of any ongoing royalty claims from the existing patents. The payment spread had been fair. Fair in the sense that the numbers were reasonable given the valuation at the time. The patent release had been the part Joel had not fully understood when he signed it. He'd understood broadly that he was giving up future royalty income. He'd needed the clean break more than he'd needed the ongoing complexity. He had a 2-year-old daughter and a divorce that was using up every unit of cognitive and emotional capacity he had. He'd signed. What he had not fully understood, what he'd understood only years later, when he'd looked at the licensing agreements that had accumulated in the decade since, was that the restructuring had also included a provision, buried in paragraph 19 of the asset transfer agreement, that transferred his co-inventor designation on the patents to a holding company Thomas had created. His name had been removed from the patents, not illegally. The transfer of inventor designation required specific procedures, and those procedures had been followed, and Joel had signed documents that authorized them without fully reading them, and the attorney he'd used during the divorce had been a family law attorney rather than an IP attorney, and had not caught what he was giving up. For 11 years, the DTM had operated in buildings across the country under a patent that bore only Thomas Feld's name. The licensing fees had flowed to Thomas's holding company. The original architecture, the work of 14 months in a warehouse in Raleigh, had become an asset Joel had no legal claim to. He'd found out 6 years after the divorce, when a former colleague who was working at a consulting firm had mentioned in passing that the Carver-Feld system had been acquired by a company called Helix Infrastructure Solutions. He'd said the name wrong, Carver something, and then corrected himself. Actually, just Feld, I think. The other guy left the business early on. Joel had gone home and looked it up. He'd read the patent record. He'd read the restructuring documents he still had copies of, carefully this time, with the specific reading of someone who understood exactly what they were looking at. He'd found paragraph 19. He'd understood what it had cost him. He'd thought about it for a long time. He'd decided, eventually, not to pursue it. The legal process would have been expensive and uncertain. The documents had been signed. He had a daughter who needed his time and attention more than he needed a legal fight with an uncertain outcome. He had a job that paid enough. He had a life that worked. Thomas had been the one who'd understood the commercial side from the beginning. Joel had understood it, but Thomas had felt it. The specific instinct for timing and positioning that some people had and others didn't. He'd known when to approach investors and how to frame the technology and which early customers to prioritize, because their data would produce the strongest case study numbers. He'd been correct about all of it. Joel had been the one who understood the system, the one who sat with a thermal problem for a week until the solution was clear. The one who knew, intuitively, that the predictive model needed more calibration depth than the standard documentation would describe, and who'd spent 3 weekends testing values until he'd found the set that produced the specific performance profile they needed. The one who'd kept the notebook. They'd worked well together. That was the honest truth, even given what came after. For 14 months in the warehouse in Raleigh, and for the first 2 years of the business, they'd worked very well together. The product they'd built was good, genuinely good, Joel knew. Not just in the way that inventors thought their inventions were good, but in the demonstrated, measurable way of a system that performed better than the alternatives in field conditions. He hadn't been wrong about Thomas's character. Thomas had been his partner, and had acted like it, for the years when acting like it was easy. The restructuring had been the circumstance that revealed a difference in how they valued the partnership versus how they valued the asset. Joel hadn't expected it. It was probably the main thing he'd taken from the experience, that you learned who people were not in the easy years, but in the moments of pressure. He'd learned it at 29. He'd carried it forward carefully. The notebook had come with him because he was thorough, and because he cleaned out desks completely, and because the notebook was his. He hadn't kept it as a weapon. He hadn't kept it as insurance. He'd kept it because it was the working record of the best technical work he'd ever done, and throwing it away would have felt like something he didn't want to do. He'd never expected to open it in a data center basement 12 years later. Life had specific ways of arranging the things you'd carried carefully. He'd put it away. He'd been putting it away for 5 years by the time he walked into the Vantara lobby for his intake inspection and recognized the schematic on the wall. The Carverfeld DTMP, operating in a building he'd been assigned to maintain, 12 years old and failing in a way that no one who hadn't built it would be able to diagnose. He'd stood in front of that schematic for 20 minutes. He'd gone home that evening and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. The notebook was there. The calibration notebook he'd kept during the original build, not the formal technical documentation that had gone into the patent filings, but the working notebook. The day-by-day record of the decisions made, the parameters adjusted, the specific non-standard initialization values that they'd arrived at through testing rather than calculation. The values that hadn't made it into the official documentation because they'd been discovered after the filing and had been treated as trade knowledge rather than patented specifications. The values that were not written down anywhere except in that notebook. The values that a system needed at certain points in its operation to function correctly. The values that 207 engineers would not know to look for. He'd sat at his desk with the notebook open for a long time. He'd thought about Dara. He'd thought about $34,000. He'd closed the notebook and put it in his work bag. Dara James Carver had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at age 5. She was now 8. 3 years of managing a condition that required constant attention, multiple daily blood glucose checks, insulin injections calibrated to what she'd eaten and what she was about to do. The specific discipline of a child who had learned to read numbers that described her own body's chemistry. She'd adapted to it with the particular matter-of-factness of children who hadn't known it before, who had no comparison point, no sense of loss, because this was simply the way her body worked. She was, Joel had thought many times, remarkable, not in the inspirational way that adults sometimes projected onto children with medical conditions, which was its own kind of condescension. Just straightforwardly remarkable as a person, curious, precise, funny in the dry way of children who'd spent time around adults in medical contexts and had absorbed some of their vocabulary and cadences. She could explain her own insulin dosing math to adults who had never thought about such things, and do it clearly enough that they understood it, which was not something many 8-year-olds could do with any subject. She was also tired. Not all the time. Not in a way that showed to most people. But Joel knew her well enough. The specific quality of her energy at different times of day. The way certain readings affected her mood. The effort involved in the constant management. To know that she was carrying more than an 8-year-old should carry. The closed-loop insulin delivery system, the device her endocrinologist had recommended 6 months ago, the device she called by its brand name with the specific hopefulness of a child who'd done her own research, was a continuous glucose monitor linked to an insulin pump by an algorithm that managed the dosing automatically. Not perfectly, not without oversight or adjustment, but close enough to automatic that a child could sleep through the night without a parent waking every 2 hours to check her levels. Close enough that the constant cognitive load of managing the condition was shared with a device rather than carried entirely by an 8-year-old and her father. The endocrinologist had said it clearly. Dara was a strong candidate, the technology was proven, the quality of life improvement for children her age was well documented. $34,000. That was the cost after 2 insurance denials. The insurer had denied the first claim on the grounds that Dara's current management was clinically adequate. The second denial, after the appeal, Joel had spent 3 weeks building with the help of an online community of parents of children with type 1, had cited the same language in slightly different arrangement. The appeal window for the third attempt closed in 6 weeks. After that, the decision was final. The pathway after a final denial was either out-of-pocket payment or waiting for a policy year reset and starting over, which was another 18 months. $34,000 in 6 weeks. Joel made $61,000 a year. Before taxes. After the child support arrangement and the apartment and the utilities and the groceries and the specific costs of managing Dara's condition, he had, at the end of each month, somewhere between $400 and $900 left. He'd known about the device for 4 months. The endocrinologist had mentioned it first. In the patient, thorough way Dr. Amara explained every option, laying out the technology, the data, the outcomes in Dara's specific profile category, giving Joel time to ask questions, which he always had many of. He'd gone home and researched it with the same thoroughness. He'd found the parent communities online, forums and social media groups of parents of children with type 1, some of whom had children who'd been using the device for years. He'd read their accounts with the specific kind of reading he did when something was both important and beyond his immediate experience. Not for reassurance, but for information, for the texture of what it actually looked like when it worked. What he'd found, consistently, was a specific kind of before and after. Before, monitoring alarms at night, parents sleeping lightly, children's sleep disrupted, the constant low-grade cognitive load of self monitoring that a child in 2nd or 3rd grade should not have to carry, the exhaustion that accumulated under that, the management fatigue that Dara had never named, but that Joel recognized in the quality of her energy at the end of certain days. After, nights that were quiet. Children who came home from school less depleted. A space in the child's attention that had been occupied by self-monitoring becoming available for the things children were supposed to be thinking about. He'd read all of it. He'd thought about Dara at the lunch table, sitting at the end nearest the wall, not for acoustic reasons, but because that position let her check her monitor discreetly when she needed to, without drawing attention to herself. He'd thought about the specific tiredness she showed sometimes after lunch, when the midday glucose variability was highest, and the management effort peaked. $34,000. He'd thought about a specific afternoon 2 months earlier. He'd been picking Dara up from school, and she'd been quiet on the walk to the truck, which was unusual for her. She was ordinarily a talker, particularly after school when the day's events were fresh, and she had opinions about all of them. He'd waited. In the truck, she'd said, "I had a low at lunch. I caught it, but I was already behind on the homework by the time I was better." A low. Her glucose had dropped. She'd noticed, corrected, managed it. She'd also lost 40 minutes of productive attention because managing the low had taken all of it. "Did you tell Miss Garner?" "I didn't want to make it a thing," she said. "I handled it." She had handled it. She was 8 years old, and she'd handled a blood sugar episode in a school cafeteria without drawing attention, without asking for help, without missing the external indicators. She'd been at her desk working when he picked her up, behind on the homework as she'd said, but working on it. She'd handled it. He'd thought about that on the drive home, about what it meant that handling it was so internalized, so automatic, that she didn't mention it until he waited long enough. About how much of her daily energy was occupied by handling things that most 8-year-olds never thought about. The device would not eliminate the lows, but it would catch them earlier and respond faster, and reduce the amplitude of the episodes and let her get the 40 minutes back. 40 minutes a day, across a childhood. He'd run the math from every angle. Payment plan. The hospital's financial office had offered a 60-month arrangement at an interest rate that would cost him approximately $11,000 above principal. He could manage the monthly payment. Barely. It would require giving up the small buffer that kept unexpected expenses from becoming crises. He'd been about to accept the payment plan when the acquaintance had mentioned Vantara's failure in passing during a facilities contractor meeting. He'd said nothing then. He'd gone home and thought about the notebook. He'd been thinking about the notebook for the entire 9 days of the Vantara failure. He'd been thinking about what it represented, what it was worth, what the specific knowledge it contained meant in the context of a company losing $4 million a day. He'd been thinking about the legal question of his right to use that knowledge, given that the patent had been transferred and his inventor credit had been removed. He'd talked to a lawyer. Not a long conversation. He'd found a patent attorney through the State Bar Association's referral service and paid for a 30-minute consultation. The attorney had listened to the summary and said 2 things that mattered. First, the removal of his inventor designation had not been legally clean. There was a difference between assigning the economic rights in a patent and removing inventor credit. And the latter required specific procedures that, from what Joel described, may not have been followed correctly. Second, regardless of the patent dispute, the knowledge in the notebook was trade knowledge he'd created. The asset transfer agreement had transferred his stake in the business and his royalty rights. It had not, as far as the attorney could determine from the description, transferred his right to use his own technical knowledge. He hadn't sold his memory. You can go in there and fix the system, the attorney had said, using your own knowledge. What you can't do is use proprietary documentation, the official technical documents, without the patent holder's authorization. Your own memory and your own notes from the build period are yours. He'd thought about the notebook. The notebook was his. It had always been his. It was a working record he'd kept for himself, not a company document. He'd taken it with him when he left because it had been in the desk drawer, and he'd cleaned out the desk, and it had gone into a box, and then into storage, and then into the bottom drawer of his current desk, where it had been for 9 years. His own notes. His own memory. His own knowledge. The attorney had said one more thing. If you can establish that you were the co-inventor and that your credit was improperly removed, you have a potential claim. It won't be fast. It won't be cheap. But 9 days of a data center at $4 million a day creates a very motivated party on the other side. If you solve the problem, you're suddenly a person whose knowledge is extremely valuable, and that changes the negotiating position considerably. Joel had listened to all of this. He'd thought about Dara. He'd gone to work the next day with the notebook in his bag. He'd been prepared to wait for the right moment. The right moment had turned out to be Renata Cross looking across a lobby and saying something she'd intended as theater, and getting an answer she hadn't expected. Fine, he'd thought. This was how it started. The day-by-day deterioration of the situation had been documented in enough detail by financial journalists that Joel had been able to follow it from the outside without going looking for it. Day 1. Capacity at 68%. Monitoring teams engaged. Day 3. Capacity at 44%. Original system integrator called in. Day 5. Capacity at 31%. 3 competing architecture firms contracted simultaneously. Academic consultants brought in from MIT. Day 7. No progress. Press conference. Renata Cross appearing in front of cameras for the 4th time and saying things that sounded like information while conveying none. Day 9. A maintenance technician in a work jacket walking through the lobby. Haynes, the CTO, had been visibly worsening over the same period. Joel had seen him in the building twice before the lobby exchange. Once in an elevator, where Haynes had been on the phone discussing flow rate anomalies in terms that told Joel the team was looking in the wrong layer. And once in the first floor corridor, where he'd been walking with 2 other people at the specific velocity of people going to an urgent meeting about a problem they couldn't solve. He had the quality of a technically excellent person being asked to defend against a failure he couldn't explain, which was its own kind of particular misery. Joel had almost said something in the elevator. He'd been close, both times, close to letting the knowledge out, to saying, I think I know what's wrong, with a reasonable expectation of being heard. He hadn't. Because he'd needed to understand the legal situation first, and because walking up to a billionaire's CTO in an elevator with an unsolicited diagnosis was not the position he wanted to be in. He'd been patient. The lobby had made patience irrelevant. The room in the basement of the Vantara building where the climate system's primary coordination hardware lived was called. In the official facility documentation, Climate Control Hub A maintenance staff called it the ice room because the cooling required to keep its own servers stable made it perpetually, uncomfortably cold. It was accessible through 2 locked doors, the second of which required both a keycard and a PIN. Renata had arranged access within an hour of the lobby exchange. He'd been taken up to the executive floor first, which he hadn't expected. He'd expected to be handed off to a facilities manager. Instead, he found himself in a glass-walled conference room with Renata Cross and a man introduced as her chief technology officer, whose name was Garrett Haynes, and who had the specific expression of a senior technical person being asked to give access to someone he had every reason to be skeptical of. "Before we do this," Haynes said, "I'd like to understand what you believe the problem is." Joel had anticipated this. The system is running a DTMP architecture, a distributed thermal management protocol. It's a predictive coordination layer sitting on top of the standard HVAC and cooling subsystems. The cascade failure pattern you're seeing is consistent with a specific initialization error in the predictive model's baseline parameters. Haynes looked at him carefully. "How do you know what architecture we're running?" "The schematics on the wall in the lobby," Joel said. A pause. Haynes glanced at Renata, who was watching Joel with an expression he couldn't fully read. "What initialization error?" Haynes said. "The predictive model needs a set of baseline calibration values to generate accurate anticipatory responses to load changes. Those values were established during the original system setup and are stored in the coordination layer's configuration database. If those values drift, or if a maintenance update overwrites them with defaults, the predictive model stops working correctly. It doesn't crash. It keeps running, but it's running on wrong assumptions. The thermal responses it generates start lagging the actual load changes, and under sustained high load, that lag compounds until you get exactly what you have now." Haynes was very still. "That's extremely specific." "Yes, our team of 200 engineers didn't identify a configuration issue. They were looking at hardware. Component failures. This isn't a component failure. It's a calibration failure in a software layer. Most engineers who haven't worked with this specific architecture wouldn't know the baseline parameter set exists." Joel paused. The official documentation doesn't fully describe it. Another pause. The quality of the silence in the room had changed. Renata spoke. "You're saying the documentation is incomplete. I'm saying there's a layer of the system whose behavior depends on values that aren't in the publicly available documentation. Engineers working from that documentation wouldn't know to look for them." She looked at him with the direct quality of someone who was revising their model of the situation faster than they were comfortable with. "And you know what those values are." "I have access to them," he said carefully. "From where?" He'd thought about how to answer this. He'd thought about it the entire drive to the building, in the elevator up to the executive floor, in the 6 minutes he'd spent waiting in the conference room before Renata and Haynes arrived. "I've worked with this architecture before," he said. "I have documentation from that work." Haynes leaned forward. "What documentation?" "The patent holder is Helix Infrastructure Solutions. Their engineering team has been here for 4 days. They couldn't solve it. The Helix team is working from the standard documentation set," Joel said. "The calibration values I have aren't in that documentation." The silence this time was different. Denser. "Where did they come from?" Renata said. He looked at her. "That's a longer conversation. Right now you're losing $4 million a day. I can fix the system. If you want to discuss the origin of the documentation after the system is running, I'm willing to have that conversation." Renata Cross looked at him for a long moment. He watched her weigh it, the skepticism against the 9 days and the $4 million a day, and the board meeting she had in 6 days that he didn't know the specific content of, but could infer was not going to be comfortable. "What do you need?" she said. "Access to Climate Control Hub A and a terminal with write access to the Coordination Layer Configuration Database." "That's it?" "That's it." She looked at Haynes. He had the expression of someone who had no better option and knew it. "Give him access," she said. The ice room was exactly as he'd expected it to be. Not from previous visits, he'd never been in this specific building's hub room before. But from the 14 months in Raleigh, from the dozens of times he'd been in the original test environment making the same room work. The layout was different, every installation was slightly different. But the hardware had the specific quality of something he'd designed, something he'd decided the form of, and being in its presence was an experience he didn't have a clean word for. Familiarity that went past recognition. He'd built this. Not this room, not this exact installation. But the architecture. The way the servers were arranged in their cooling relationship. The logic of the airflow routing. The coordination layer sitting on top of all of it, doing the work of anticipation that was the whole point of the system. He'd built all of it. He pulled the notebook from his bag. The coordination layer's configuration interface was accessible through a terminal mounted on the wall. The interface was 12 years old and looked it, a text-based system with a command structure he recognized immediately, because he'd specified it. He navigated to the baseline parameter database in 4 keystrokes. The values were wrong. Not wrong in the way of random corruption. Wrong in the specific way of values that had been overwritten by a default restore. The kind of thing that happened when a system update didn't correctly identify non-standard configuration entries and reset them. A routine update, run sometime in the past month, had wiped the baseline calibration and replaced it with the default values from the installation template. The default values were close to right, close enough that the system would run under normal conditions. But under high sustained load, the margin between the defaults and the optimized values was exactly enough to create the thermal lag that had cascaded into the current failure. He opened the notebook. The values were on page 47. 11 lines of numbers, each representing a specific calibration parameter, each arrived at through a specific testing process in a warehouse in Raleigh in the second year of the Obama administration. He entered them. It took 9 minutes. When he entered the last value and committed the configuration, the system didn't announce anything. It didn't make a sound. The servers didn't suddenly roar back to life with dramatic acceleration. What happened was quiet. The coordination layer's predictive model, now running on correct baseline assumptions, began generating accurate anticipatory responses, and the cooling subsystems began responding to those responses, and the thermal lag that had been compounding for 9 days began, gradually and then more quickly, to resolve. He watched the monitoring displays for 20 minutes. The system performance graphs climbed. 40%, 55, 70. The Helix infrastructure engineers had left a terminal session open when they'd last been in the hub room. He could see the command history still in the buffer, the diagnostic queries they'd run, the component tests, the hardware verification sequences, all of it correct. All of it looking in the right places for a hardware fault. All of it finding nothing, because nothing was wrong with the hardware. He felt, looking at their work, a specific kind of recognition. They were competent. They were thorough. They had simply been looking for the wrong kind of failure, because the documentation they had didn't describe the correct kind. He thought about the documentation gap. It had happened because the calibration values had been discovered after the patent filings. That was the technical reality. But the practical consequence was that the system's most critical configuration parameters, the values that determined whether the predictive model worked correctly under load, existed nowhere in the written record except in his notebook. He'd known this for 12 years. He'd thought about it abstractly, as a fact about the world, without thinking about its implications. He was thinking about its implications now, watching a data center's performance metrics climbing back toward normal, while the Helix engineers' command history sat in a terminal buffer as a monument to what good engineering looks like when it doesn't know what it doesn't know. At 94%, he allowed himself to sit on the floor against the wall and look at the system running. He'd been this age, a different age, but the same quality of age, the age where you'd done the work and were waiting for the numbers to confirm it, in the warehouse in Raleigh too. Sitting on a concrete floor watching the dyno readouts after the first full test run of the original prototype. Thomas had been there, standing, too excited to sit. Joel had been sitting because he'd been tired in the specific way of someone who'd been working at capacity for months and had just finished the thing that the months were for. The system had run correctly that day too. He sat on the floor in the ice room and watched the display climb to 96%. Then he got up, closed the notebook, and went back upstairs. He closed the notebook. He walked back out through the 2 locked doors and took the elevator up to the executive floor. Renata Cross was in the conference room. So was Haynes and 3 other people Joel didn't know who had the look of senior staff who had been called in quickly. They were all watching the performance monitors on the large screen at the end of the table. The number on the screen said 87% and climbing. Renata looked at him when he walked in. "What did you do?" she said. Not quite a question. "Corrected the baseline calibration in the coordination layer configuration database," he said. "A recent system update overwrote the non-standard values with defaults. The predictive model couldn't compensate under sustained load. How long will it take to reach full capacity? Should be at 98-99% within the hour. The system's been running degraded for 9 days. There may be some buffer queue clearing that takes another few hours before all metrics normalize. But the thermal issue is resolved." Haynes was staring at the monitor. He said, without looking away from it, "Those values aren't in any documentation we have." "I know," Joel said. "Where did they come from?" This was the moment. Joel had thought about it the entire time he'd been in the ice room. He'd thought about the attorney's words. He'd thought about the notebook in his bag and what it represented. He'd thought about Dara and the appeal window and the 6 weeks. "I was the co-inventor of the DTMP," he said, 12 years ago, before the patents were transferred. "The calibration values are from my working documentation of the original build." The room went quiet. Renata looked at him with the same sharp recalibration he'd seen in the lobby, but deeper now. "You're saying you built this system," she said. "I co-designed the architecture. Jointly with Thomas Feld, before the business restructuring that transferred my patent rights. Helix Infrastructure owns the DTMP patents. Helix owns what was transferred. The question of what was properly transferred is something my attorney is currently reviewing." He met her eyes. "What I'm telling you right now is factual. I have co-inventor knowledge of this system that no one working from the current documentation has. That knowledge is why the system is running again." A long silence. "What do you want?" Haynes said. His voice was flat, not hostile. Joel had thought about this too. "A fair fee for the repair work," he said, "and a conversation about the documentation. The system will fail again if the baseline values aren't properly protected in the configuration database. Whoever maintains this building needs to know those values exist and how to preserve them through future updates." "That's all?" "That's where I'd like to start." Renata looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked at the monitor. 91%. "Get legal in here," she said quietly, to no one in particular. Legal arrived 11 minutes later. The cease and desist arrived 2 days after the system came back online. Joel had been expecting something. He hadn't known the form it would take: an injunction, a civil complaint, a letter from Helix's attorneys positioning themselves for litigation. What arrived was a cease and desist letter addressed to him personally at his home address, which meant someone had done at minimum a basic background search in the past 48 hours, and which contained language asserting that his disclosure of proprietary technical information relating to the DTMP architecture, patent reference number US10 4XX XXXB2, constitutes a material breach of the asset transfer agreement executed between Joel R. Carver and Thomas A. Feld on March 14th. He read it twice. He called the patent attorney. Her name was Gwen Park, and she'd moved from the 30-minute consultation to a full representation relationship after Joel had paid a retainer from the emergency fund he maintained for exactly the kind of unexpected problem that life with a child with a chronic medical condition periodically generated. They moved fast, she said, when he read her the key provisions. What does it mean? It means Helix is scared. A cease and desist isn't a lawsuit. It's a warning shot. They're trying to establish that you violated the asset transfer agreement before you have a chance to establish that the agreement was itself flawed. A pause. They're also trying to signal to Renata Cross's company that doing business with you creates legal risk. Can they prevent the fee payment? They can try to inject uncertainty into it. Whether they succeed depends on what Renata Cross decides to do, which depends on how much legal risk she's willing to absorb and how much she values a clean resolution. Gwen's voice was measured. Here's the key question. The asset transfer agreement transferred your business stake and royalty rights. Did it include your personal knowledge and working notes? You told me it didn't. I believe it doesn't, based on standard contract interpretation. But Helix's attorneys may argue that the working notes constitute company records rather than personal documentation, given that they were created during the course of the business. She paused. We need to establish clearly that the notebook predates any formal company documentation and was maintained as your personal record. It does. The dates are in the notebook. It's handwritten. The first entry is from the week I started building the prototype, before Thomas and I had formalized the partnership paperwork. Good, that matters. Another pause. I'm going to file a response to the cease and desist today. I'm also going to file a preliminary inquiry with the Patent Office about the inventor designation transfer. If the procedures weren't properly followed, we have grounds to petition for correction. That's a separate track from the asset transfer dispute. And it's potentially stronger because it doesn't depend on the contract language. He sat at his kitchen table and thought about parallel tracks and timelines and the 6 weeks left on the appeal window. How long does the Patent Office inquiry take? The preliminary filing, a few days. A response from the examiner, weeks to months. A final correction, months to years. She was quiet for a moment, but the filing itself creates a record. It establishes that you've made the claim, and it puts Helix in the position of having to respond to the Patent Office, which is a different kind of legal exposure than responding to you. What does Renata Cross's company do while all this is happening? That's the variable. He could hear her thinking. Renata Cross has a problem. She's been publicly embarrassed by a 9-day failure that 200 engineers couldn't fix. A maintenance worker solved it. If she handles this badly, if she tries to sidestep the fee or use the cease and desist as cover to avoid acknowledging what happened, that story gets worse for her in the press. If she handles it well, she has a chance to control the narrative. What does handling it well look like? Paying the fee, publicly acknowledging the repair, potentially, and this is her decision, not ours, supporting your inventor credit claim in some formal capacity, which would be unusual, but would demonstrate that she's not complicit in the original rights issue. He thought about Renata in the conference room. The specific quality of her watching the performance monitors climb to 91%. The expression on her face that he still couldn't fully characterize, not relief exactly. Something more complicated. He thought about the compliance gap he'd seen the signs of, but hadn't pursued. The deferred maintenance items in the system. The ones he'd flagged in his intake report. The ones that had been pushed to the following quarter repeatedly for budget reasons. There was a regulatory dimension to data center climate maintenance that most people didn't think about. Climate systems and facilities hosting healthcare and financial data had compliance obligations. The maintenance logs he'd reviewed during his intake had shown a pattern of deferral that, if examined closely, suggested the system had been operating outside its compliance window for longer than the current failure period. That wasn't Joel's problem. He'd flagged it in his report and submitted it, and that was the extent of his professional obligation. But it was the thing Renata was protecting, he thought. The thing that had given her that specific quality of controlled fear in the lobby. Not the $4 million a day, that was recoverable. A compliance gap, if it came out in the context of a public failure, was harder. She needed this resolved quickly, quietly, and in a way that didn't generate additional investigation. The 48 hours after Gwen filed the Patent Office preliminary inquiry were the kind of hours that moved slowly. He went to work both days, completing the rest of his rotation, the 2 buildings he'd been assigned beyond Vantera, an office tower and a mixed-use retail space whose climate systems required the ordinary attention of systems that had been maintained correctly and were therefore operating correctly. He did the work carefully, as he always did. He wrote up his reports. He submitted them. He was a maintenance technician on a municipal facilities contract, and that was his job. And the job needed to be done regardless of what was happening in patent attorney offices and data center conference rooms. On the second evening, he'd picked Dara up from after-school care, and they'd stopped at the library on the way home because she'd reserved a book and the hold had come in. She'd been reading above her grade level for 2 years, and the librarians knew her by name and had opinions about what she should read next that she took seriously and sometimes agreed with. She'd picked up the book and checked it out with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times. On the walk to the truck, she'd looked at him with the evaluative regard he'd grown used to. "You look like you're waiting for something," she said. "I am," he said. "Is it the work thing?" "Part of the work thing, yeah," she thought about this. "Is it the part that involves lawyers?" He looked at her. "How do you know about lawyers?" "You had a call," she said. "You walked to the other room, but I could hear the word attorneys." "I wasn't eavesdropping. The volume was just carrying." He opened the truck door for her. She climbed in with her book. "Yeah," he said. "The part that involves lawyers." "Is that the expensive part or the slow part?" "Both," he said. "That's annoying," she said, and opened her book. He'd driven home thinking about what it meant to be an 8-year-old who had developed a taxonomy of problems that distinguished expensive parts from slow parts. Not alarmed by it, just aware of what it meant about the texture of their life together. The specific things that were in the air, the vocabulary that accumulated. The particular kind of competence a child developed when they were paying attention to a parent who was managing things. He'd tried to make sure most of what she absorbed from watching him was the managing correctly part, rather than the underneath weight part. He thought he'd done reasonably well at this. Reasonably well was all he had. Gwen called on the 4th morning. He'd told Dara that evening that work had been complicated, but that it was getting less complicated. She'd accepted this with the equanimity she brought to most things and asked what they were having for dinner, and the conversation had moved on to pasta versus rice and the relative advantages of each, and whether a person could reasonably prefer both in equal measure or whether preference required a ranking. He'd made pasta. He'd sat across from her and watched her eat and thought about the letter from Helix's attorneys and the patent attorney's response and the specific machinery of legal processes moving at their own speed in rooms he wasn't in. The insurance appeal was the clock. Everything else was secondary to the clock. 6 weeks was not a long time. It was not a short time either. It was exactly the kind of timeline that required things to move faster than they naturally wanted to move. He'd called his brother in Atlanta, not for money. He'd stopped calling people for money when it had become clear no one in his circle had it at the scale required. But because his brother had been through a complicated legal situation 7 years ago involving a workplace dispute, and had emerged with the specific knowledge of someone who'd been through a process and could say what it was like on the inside. The lawyers set the pace, his brother had said. You can't push the pace. What you can do is make sure your lawyer has everything they need the moment they need it, so there's no lag on your side. He'd kept Gwen updated. Every document, every piece of information she'd asked for, provided within hours. The notebook had been digitized and copies made at 3 different locations. His original contract documentation had been pulled from the storage unit and organized chronologically and scanned. The timeline he'd reconstructed of the original build and the patent filings and the restructuring had been reviewed and verified and cross-referenced with whatever public records were accessible. He'd been thorough. Thoroughness was the only form of speed available to him. He called Gwen back. "I have some leverage," he said. "Tell me." He told her about the deferred maintenance logs, about the compliance obligations, about his intake report, and what it had documented. Gwen was quiet for a moment. "Then, you're not going to threaten her with it." "No, but she knows I've seen it. She knows I flagged it. If this becomes a prolonged legal fight, the maintenance logs become discoverable." "You don't have to say any of this explicitly." "I won't. I think she's already thought about it." "Okay," Gwen said. "Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to send a letter to Vantera's legal team. Not a demand, a communication. It will outline the situation. Note that you have an ongoing relationship with the building as its contracted maintenance technician, and suggest that a resolution that acknowledges your contribution and compensates you fairly is in everyone's interest." A pause. "I'm going to word it carefully enough that Renata Cross's attorneys understand everything, without me having to say it." He thought about that, about what unsaid things could carry. How long will it take? To send the letter? A day. To get a response? That depends on how fast they're moving. Given that they've already heard about the system repair and are presumably aware of the press implications, I'd guess we hear back within the week. He looked at the kitchen calendar. 5 weeks and 4 days until the insurance appeal window closed. "Make it faster if you can," he said. Gwen called back in 4 days. The negotiation happened in a conference room at the offices of Vantara's outside counsel, in a building downtown that smelled of recirculated air and had furniture chosen to convey stability without warmth. Gwen was there. 2 of Renata's attorneys were there. Renata herself was not present, which Joel had expected. People at her level sent representation for opening positions and appeared personally only when they were ready to close. He sat across the table and let Gwen do the talking. The opening position from Vantara's counsel was a one-time payment of $40,000 in exchange for Joel's technical consultation and system restoration services, and a confidentiality agreement covering the details of the repair. Gwen had said, before they walked in, that she expected this, and that it was not a serious offer. It was a number designed to see if he'd take it rather than one they actually thought resolved the situation. He hadn't taken it. Gwen's response had been measured and specific. The repair had ended 9 days of losses running to $4.2 million daily. The knowledge that enabled the repair was co-inventor knowledge that the subject of an ongoing patent office inquiry. The cease and desist from Helix Infrastructure would be contested on the grounds that the asset transfer agreement had not validly transferred inventor designation, which was a legal question that would ultimately be resolved in Joel's favor based on the specific procedures that had and had not been followed. The appropriate resolution was not a one-time consulting fee structured to limit Vantara's exposure, but a fair payment that reflected the actual value of the service rendered. She had put a number on the table. $200,000. The room had been very still. One of Vantara's attorneys had said something about the cease and desist creating significant uncertainty about what Joel was legally entitled to receive. Gwen had said something about patent office procedures and inventor designation requirements, and the specific language of the asset transfer agreement that Helix would need to defend in detail. They had gone back and forth for an hour and 40 minutes. At the end of it, they had agreed on $175,000. Not as a consulting fee, as a settlement and service acknowledgement. The document Gwen drafted included specific language. The payment was made in acknowledgement of Joel Carver's technical contribution to the restoration of the Vantara climate system, including his application of co-inventor knowledge related to the DTMP architecture. Co-inventor knowledge. In writing. In a signed legal document. It wasn't a patent correction. It wasn't the full restoration of his inventor credit, but it was a company worth billions putting in writing, in a legal document, that he had co-inventor knowledge of the system they relied on. Gwen had explained this carefully at the end of the session, when they were alone. This language doesn't win the patent dispute, but it creates a record. If Helix wants to contest your inventor designation at the patent office, Vantara's document is now evidence of your co-inventor knowledge being commercially relied upon. That changes the shape of the dispute. He'd sat with that on the drive home. He thought about Dara. $175,000. He'd been a maintenance technician, making $61,000 a year before taxes. He'd been managing a gap of $34,000 with $400 of monthly surplus. He'd been reading the insurance denial letters with the specific, careful attention of someone reading something important and devastating and not allowing himself to react until he'd read every word. $175,000. He drove home through the November afternoon. He went to the pharmacy that evening and filled Dara's prescription while she sat on the counter and watched him deal with the pharmacist and swung her legs and told him about a project at school involving models of the solar system and the specific disagreement she'd had with her group partner about the relative size of Neptune. Neptune is bigger than Uranus, she said. He kept saying they're basically the same. Neptune is slightly larger, Joel said. About 3%. That's what I said. She looked satisfied. I looked it up. He paid for the prescription. They walked out to the truck. Dad, she said. Yeah, is the work thing figured out? He looked at her. She was 8 years old and she'd learned to read the signs that things were complicated in the way that children of single parents learn, because the information was always nearby and the adult was the only one to read it from. Yeah, he said. The work thing is figured out. She looked at him for a moment with the evaluative quality she'd developed, the specific way of checking information against what she already knew. Okay, she said. She believed him. He drove them home. The second session had been different from the first. Renata had come herself. She'd arrived 20 minutes into the session, with no announcement, sitting down at the end of the conference table with the particular quality of someone who had decided to be present rather than briefed. She'd listened to the ongoing exchange for a few minutes. Then she'd said, "What does Mr. Carver need for this to be resolved correctly?" Her attorneys had looked at her. Joel had looked at her. Gwen had answered, calmly, precisely, the payment acknowledging his contribution, the language in the settlement document specifically referencing co-inventor knowledge, and Vantara's cooperation with the Patent Office inquiry if and when cooperation was requested. Renata had looked at Joel directly. The language in the settlement document. That matters to you. It matters to the record, he said. The settlement payment matters for practical reasons. The language matters for the historical record. You want your name on what you built. It was said without inflection. Not a challenge, just the specific clarity of someone who was in the habit of saying exactly what she understood. I want the record to be accurate, he said. She'd looked at him for a moment. I understand that, she said. She'd told her attorneys, without looking at them, that the language Gwen had proposed was acceptable. Then she'd looked at Joel again. The system, she said. The deferred maintenance. You flagged it in your intake report. Yes, we have a compliance problem. That's your determination to make. I've made it. She looked at her hands. We're going to address it. Properly, she looked up. I wanted you to know that. He'd thought about why she was telling him this. Not because she had to. The settlement agreement didn't require it. Not as leverage in the negotiation. It was being said after the agreement had been essentially reached. She was telling him because she'd decided she wanted him to know. Thank you, he said. It was a small exchange, 2 or 3 sentences, but it changed the quality of what the resolution was. It wasn't just a transaction. It was a person choosing to be accountable for a thing she could have quietly buried. He'd driven home thinking about that. The patent dispute was a longer road. Gwen had filed the preliminary inquiry with the Patent Office 2 weeks earlier, and the process would take months and possibly years to reach a final resolution. Thomas Feld's holding company, through Helix, had retained counsel and was contesting the inventor designation claim on the grounds that the asset transfer agreement had been properly executed and willingly signed. Gwen was not discouraged by this. She'd shown Joel the specific paragraphs of patent law governing inventor designation requirements and had explained, with the patient precision of someone who enjoyed the architecture of legal arguments, why the transfer had not followed the required procedures, and why a court or the patent office was likely to find in Joel's favor when the matter was fully examined. He believed her. He wasn't counting on a timeline. The Vantara settlement was real and documented, and in his account. The language in the settlement document was real and documented. The appeal letter Gwen had helped him build for Dara's insurance coverage was filed the week after the settlement, funded by a company now providing documentation of his co-inventor knowledge of a system they relied on. The insurance company, reviewing the third appeal, had approved the device. He'd read the approval letter at the kitchen table while Dara was at school. He'd read it 3 times. Then he'd folded it carefully and put it in the folder he kept for her medical documents. He'd made coffee. He'd sat at the table for a while. Some things you worked for and fought for and built carefully over weeks of careful work, and then one day the pieces were in place and the configuration was correct and the system ran the way it was supposed to run. That was all it ever was. The press had gotten the story in pieces, the way press always did, assembling something from the available fragments, not quite getting it right. Occasionally getting it very right in ways that were uncomfortable. The first stories had been brief. Data center restored after 9-day outage. Company confirms system operational. The second wave had been more interesting. Local maintenance worker solves problem that stumped 200 engineers. The third wave, after Gwen's filing with the Patent Office, had become public record. Had been the kind of story that moved beyond technology publications. Co-inventor dispute over key data center technology. Single father claims his name was removed from patents worth millions. Renata Cross had been asked about Joel Carver at a press briefing. She'd answered in a way that Joel had not expected. Mr. Carver restored our system using knowledge that our own technical teams didn't have access to, she'd said. We've compensated him fairly for that contribution. I've also been made aware of the circumstances around the original patent documentation, and I want to be clear, we are not going to take a position that makes it harder for the correct history of that technology to be established. Whatever the legal process determines was the appropriate inventor credit, Vantara's position is that we will cooperate fully with that determination. It was not a statement she'd had to make. It had not been required by their settlement agreement. It was a choice she'd made. And the specific quality of it, the directness, the refusal to hide behind legal ambiguity, had told Joel something about the conversation she'd had with herself between the lobby exchange and that briefing. He'd watched the statement online at his desk at work, between the 3rd and 4th building on his afternoon rotation. He'd watched it twice. He'd thought about what she'd been protecting when she'd stood in the lobby making theatrical bets with a man she didn't know. The compliance gap. The deferred maintenance. The things she'd been managing quietly. She'd addressed that too, in a separate statement issued through a PR firm. An internal review had identified maintenance deferral practices that didn't meet the company's standards. A remediation plan had been implemented. External auditors had been engaged. The statement had been careful and specific, and had gotten ahead of what would have been a more damaging story if someone had forced it out rather than Vantara releasing it voluntarily. She'd made the decision to get in front of it, not because she had to, because it was the right thing to do. Joel had thought about that choice, about the specific courage of choosing disclosure over concealment when concealment was still available. The data center trade publication story had been the first to connect the dots. A journalist who covered infrastructure technology and who had evidently done significant background research had published a piece whose headline was "The Missing Calibration Values: How a 12-Year Documentation Gap Quietly Threatened an Entire Architecture." It was technical, detailed, and accurate in a way that told Joel the journalist had spoken to people who understood the system. Possibly former colleagues from the original build, possibly engineers who'd worked with the DTMP at other facilities and had their own experience of things that worked until they didn't. The piece mentioned Joel by name. It described him as a co-inventor whose credit had been transferred as part of a business restructuring and who had filed a patent office inquiry. It described the notebook without naming the specific contents as the key to the repair. It quoted, from public filings, the language from the Vantera settlement that referenced co-inventor knowledge. He'd read it at the shop on his lunch break. He'd forwarded it to Gwen. She'd called within the hour. Have you seen the Helix response? No. They issued a statement this morning through their PR firm. It says they're cooperating fully with the Patent Office inquiry and that they're committed to the accuracy of the historical record for the DTMP architecture. He'd sat with that. What does that mean practically? It means their attorneys have looked at the situation and have told them that contesting the inventor designation is going to be a very public, very expensive fight that they're not guaranteed to win, now that the story is out and documented and has a journalist who understands the technical details following it. Gwen's voice had the particular measured quality of someone delivering good news carefully. It means we're closer to a negotiated correction than I expected to be this quickly. How close? They've requested a meeting. Next week. I'm going to that meeting prepared to agree on a timeline for a joint submission to the Patent Office requesting the correction. He'd looked at the wall of the shop, at the tools hanging in their places, at the sticker on the workbench that Dara had put there 3 years ago. A small orange star with a face on it, there for no reason except that she'd had a sticker and he'd had a workbench. Call me after, he'd said. Of course, she'd said. The meeting had happened. The timeline had been agreed. The joint submission was being drafted. His name was going back on the patent. Not immediately. The Patent Office process had its own timeline, and the formal correction would take months. But the agreement was made, and the submission was prepared, and the correction was coming. Joel had sat with this at the kitchen table one evening while Dara slept. The quiet of the apartment around him. The refrigerator's hum. The heat through the vents. He'd built a system when he was 26 years old in a warehouse in Raleigh, and the system had run in 47 facilities for 12 years, and his name had been missing from it for 11 of those years. And now his name was going back. Not loudly, not with any particular ceremony, just through the correct functioning of a process that was built to catch this specific kind of error, running at its own pace, arriving at the right answer. Some restorations took time. Some things waited until the record was ready to be set right. He'd sent her an email, not to her assistant, not through lawyers, to the direct address she'd put on a card she'd handed him at the end of the conference room meeting, the day the system came back online. I watched your statement, he'd written. Thank you for the part about the inventor record. That mattered to me. She'd written back the same day. It should have been said clearly the first time. I'm sorry it wasn't. He'd read that several times too. The karma didn't feel like victory. He wasn't sure what he'd expected it to feel like. But it wasn't this. More like the steady resolution of something that had been under tension for a long time. The specific sensation of a system returning to its correct operating parameters. Not dramatic. Just right. Thomas Feld's holding company had, through Helix's attorneys, signaled a willingness to discuss the inventor designation question. Gwen had said this was the best-case early indicator. It meant Helix had looked at the Patent Office procedures and concluded that their position was weaker than they'd initially assessed. A negotiated correction was possible. Not guaranteed, not imminent, but possible. If the correction happened, his name would go back on the patent. 12 years. Removed for the cost of a paragraph he hadn't read carefully enough, in a moment when he'd been too depleted to read carefully, in a divorce process where he'd been managing more than he could manage at once. The world didn't always correct its errors. But sometimes, if you kept the notebook and waited and showed up at the right moment with the right knowledge, the correction was available. He'd kept the notebook. He'd showed up. The rest was still in process. The patent office would take the time it took. Helix would cooperate or contest, and the law would eventually determine the answer. The settlement was documented, and the language was in writing, and his attorney was good, and his case was strong. Some things you had to let move at their own speed. The device arrived on a Friday in December, in a box that was smaller than Joel had expected, given what it contained and what it cost and what it was going to do for his daughter's life. Dara opened it herself, because it was her device, and she'd been tracking the shipping status for 2 days, checking the page on the tablet with the specific dedicated attention she brought to things she was waiting for. When the delivery notification came, she'd been at the kitchen table doing homework, and she'd looked up and said, "It's here." She carried the box inside and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment before opening it. Joel stood in the doorway and watched her. She opened it carefully, not with impatience, with the deliberate quality of someone who understood that the thing inside was worth treating carefully. The device was in 2 components. The continuous glucose monitor, small and flat, designed to sit on the skin of her upper arm with a sensor that read glucose levels every 5 minutes, and the insulin pump, small enough to clip to clothing or wear in a case. The algorithm connecting them was in the app on the phone they'd pre-configured the previous week with the endocrinologist. She picked up the monitor and looked at it. "It's lighter than I thought," she said. "Is that good or bad?" She considered this. "Good. I thought it would feel like something." She read through the setup guide with the focused attention she'd shown with every medical thing she'd ever been asked to understand. She asked 2 questions that her endocrinologist had already answered in the previous appointment, and that she was now asking again to confirm her own understanding. Joel answered them. She nodded. They went through the sensor placement together. The nurse had walked them through it at the pre-training appointment, and Dara had absorbed the technique with her usual thoroughness. She did it herself, with Joel watching but not helping, because she'd said she wanted to do it herself. The first reading came through 6 minutes later. She looked at the number on the phone screen. It matched the manual check she'd done 10 minutes before, well within acceptable range. She looked at it for a moment and then looked up at Joel. "It works," she said. "Yeah," he said. She looked at the number again. "I don't have to count it myself," she said. "It does it for you." She sat with that for a moment. He watched her process what it meant. Not just the specific number on the screen, but the larger thing. The thing that the number on the screen represented. That she didn't have to hold this alone. That the device was going to hold part of it with her. "What does it feel like?" he said. She thought about it carefully. "Like a teammate," she said. "Like I have a teammate now." He sat down next to her at the kitchen table. She was looking at the phone screen, watching the number. 5-minute updates. The algorithm in the background, watching her glucose trend and preparing the pump response that would keep the number in the range where she felt right, where she could concentrate in school without part of her brain monitoring her own blood chemistry, where she could sleep through the night. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, the number looks good right now." "It does," he said. "It'll look good tomorrow too, probably." The endocrinologist said it usually takes a few days to really calibrate. "But yeah." "Probably," she nodded. She set the phone down flat on the table so the screen was visible without holding it, and went back to her homework with the particular ease of someone who has just been given back a portion of their attention. Joel made dinner. Pasta. Simple. The kind he could make while thinking about other things. He thought about a warehouse in Raleigh and 14 months of building something from nothing. About a notebook and a bottom drawer, and the 11 years he'd carried it without knowing exactly what for. About a lobby and a woman with a champagne flute pointing at the air and saying something she'd meant to be theatrical. About how the right knowledge in the right moment was the only kind of preparation that was ever really possible. He plated the pasta and called Dara to the table, and she came with the phone in her hand, still watching the number. "Still good?" he asked. "Still good," she said. She set the phone beside her plate so she could see the screen while she ate. She told him about the solar system project, which had progressed from the Neptune disagreement to a dispute about the comparative color accuracy of the model planets, which she'd resolved by finding reference images from NASA and presenting them to the group without comment. "How did they take it?" Joel asked. "They said the colors were just for aesthetics." "What did you say?" "I said that was a choice they could make, but they should know they were making it." He looked at his daughter. 8 years old, eating pasta, watching the number on the screen that was going to watch her while she slept, conducting herself in her school project group with the calm precision of someone who understood the difference between what was true and what was convenient. He thought about the patent, about the long road still ahead on that particular piece of justice, about Gwen's cautious optimism and the patent office's timeline, and the slow, careful work of establishing what had always been true. Some corrections took time. Some things had to wait for the right moment, the right evidence, the right combination of circumstance and preparation. The number on the screen updated, still in range. The algorithm had made a small adjustment. The device was doing its job. Outside, December was doing what December did in Connecticut, pressing the temperature down, sending the last leaves off the trees, making the sky the particular gray that meant winter was fully committed. Dara finished her pasta. She pushed the plate aside and pulled her homework back toward her and picked up her pencil and worked in the quiet kitchen, the device on her arm doing what it did. The number on the screen holding steady, the winter outside doing nothing that could come in. The morning after the device arrived, he made eggs. She'd asked for them the night before and they'd both forgotten, and then she'd woken up and remembered, and come to the kitchen with the phone in her hand showing him the overnight glucose graph, smooth and even through all 8 hours, the algorithm's small adjustments so frequent and gradual they barely registered as movement. A nearly straight line from 11 at night to 6:30 in the morning. "Look at the line," she said. "I see it," he said. "It's a great line." "It is." She set the phone on the counter where they could both see the screen and climbed onto her stool, and he made the eggs. And the morning was exactly what it was supposed to be. His daughter watching numbers that were being taken care of while he made breakfast. Both of them in the ordinary light of a December morning in an apartment where the heat worked and the refrigerator hummed and the device on. Her arm was doing the part of the work she'd been doing alone. Joel washed the dishes. He listened to the sounds of the apartment, the particular hum of the refrigerator, the heat coming through the vents, Dara's pencil on paper, the small, ordinary sounds of a place that was working as it was supposed to. He'd built the architecture. He'd built it at 26 in a warehouse where the heat didn't work correctly in January and you wore a second jacket. He'd built it through the months when the testing wasn't working, and they didn't know why. And he'd sat with the problem the way he sat with all problems, not forcing it, not rushing it, just keeping his attention on it until the answer was available. He'd built it with Thomas, and then he'd given up more than he'd understood, and then he'd spent 11 years in the ordinary life that the loss had forced him into, which had turned out to contain Dara, which had turned out to be the life. There was a version of the events where he'd kept the business, kept the patent, kept the credit, kept everything. He thought about it sometimes. He didn't prefer it. The version he'd lived had given him a daughter who developed a taxonomy of problems that distinguished expensive parts from slow parts, who moved through a difficult medical condition with the calm precision of someone who understood the difference between what was true and what was convenient, who at 8 years old could explain her own insulin dosing math more clearly than most adults could. Explain their own medical situations. He'd gotten the better version. The notebook was still in the bottom drawer. He kept it there now not because he was holding it as a reserve, but because it was part of the record. The working record of 14 months of building something from nothing. The evidence that he'd been thorough and careful and that his name belonged on the thing he'd made. The evidence now that he was the kind of person who kept good notes. He'd built the architecture. He'd kept the notebook. He'd shown up. The rest was just the system doing what the system was built to do, when it was running on the right values.